it is a great joy having the opportunity to explore the topic of Kundalini awakening with Dr. Gabriel Cousens. I hope you, the viewers, are as excited as I am. Kundalini as a concept and a potential evolutionary reality seems to be as old as humanity itself. And still, despite the enormous amount of materials written and spoken about it, it has remained a great mystery. Gabriel, as a Kundalini master, was directly initiated and acknowledged by the well-respected Swami Muktananda, is without doubt a source of significant insight into this topic, especially since aside from his direct knowledge, he is also a holistic physician and an expert in spiritual nutrition. And this is, of course, only a limited list of his qualifications. So, hello, Gabriel.
Well, Shai, I'm so happy to be here and to be sharing this with my brothers and sisters really in all of Europe, to really bring this understanding at a deeper level for people. So I'm very pleased.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this joy.
Thank you for setting this up. You and Carlos. Very good.
Thank you. So, Gabriel, in this conversation, I intend to present fundamental questions about Kundalini awakening. And here is the most fundamental question, which is simply, what is Kundalini? What arouses Kundalini? I think these are the two most basic questions.
Okay. So, Kundalini, in a more philosophical, is the grace of God that leads us to the heart of God. Okay. So in the cosmic picture, which is also experiential, there's really two heads to the Kundalini, often symbolized as the cobra or serpent. You have what we call the spiritual Kundalini, which is the cosmic Kundalini. It's always coming down into us. It's always happening, okay? And it goes through the 72,000 nadis, which are subtle channels. This is more Vedic description. And the three main channels, Ida, Pingali, and Sushumna, Sushumna being the central channel, and actually to the Brahma Nadi, which is the central channel of the central channel, okay? Mm-hmm. And that actually is the only nadi that goes all the way to the crown. So we have this constant flow of energy going down. And at that level, it's the life force. It's not necessarily spiritualizing force. Now, at the same time, we have what I'm going to call Shakti Kundalini. It's an Indian term, which is divine energy, sacred feminine energy that's stored not at the base of the spine, not in the base chakra, but below the base chakra in the Yukta Trivini, three rivers, Ida, Pingali, and Sushumna. They're flowing below the base chakra. So it's not stored in the base chakra. A lot of people get that mixed up. It's sitting in potential. Now, when that potential is activated, let's say you need 10 units, just being concrete for a second, it's sitting there at 6 units. And the cosmic Kundalini is coming down at 2 units. Well, how are we going to get to 10? We're at 8. So when people are spiritually ready, that 2 units can be received. Traditionally, it's by a process we call Shaktipat, which is known as descent of grace, which is in alignment with what we're talking about. Now, the key with it is, how does that happen? The traditional way is by a person who, a liberated person who is actually, the Kundalini is already activated, and they can transfer that energy to you. This is not just a yogic system or a Vedic system. We see it in the Torah tradition. Moses looked at Yogi, he was awakened. The Num tribesmen in the Kalahari desert, they call it the Num, they do this fire ceremony and they awaken it. So this energy is universal. Different names, that's all. It's universal. And there are different ways. So in the ceremony for the tribal Africans, they do an actual conscious ceremony to awaken the Num, N-U-M. Okay. So in the Indian tradition, which is very much more conscious of this flow of energy, okay, and has got the best terminology for the flow of energy, it's the transfer of that Shakti Kundalini, and that can awaken it. Now, can it happen other ways? Yes. I've worked with women who had the Kundalini awaken given childbirth. It's a common thing. Where's that happening? It's below the base chakra. And they don't know what's going on. Like, did I just go crazy? No, you had the Kundalini awaken. So part of how I've learned about this is in 1976, we started the first Kundalini crisis clinic. And people would come, they don't have a background, but something has happened that's very strange, and they're having spiritual experiences, and they're just regular people, giving birth or whatever's happening for them. And this is mysterious. So it can be awakened in those different ways, but the traditional way is the awakening through a liberated spiritual master who's been empowered by his or her spiritual teacher, or guru, and has a lineage to it. Why is that important? I see different people, some people have energy and they can awaken these things, but there's no lineage, and they can really have a disorder in the Kundalini. And so my lineage in the Eastern tradition literally goes back to Shiva, 8,000 years ago, we guess, Shiva was a real person living in a forest, married, and started this tradition. Now it goes back to what we call the Siddha yogis at the same time. These are people who had the siddhi, or the power to awaken it. So there's a tradition. Now, why is that important? Because it holds the energy. I've seen people who were yogis, but they didn't, and they had the Kundalini awaken, but it was out of control. And when I would work with them and give them Shaktipat in a meditating setup, they're getting the lineage that stabilizes it. And that's maybe sometimes all I have to do. And they're fine. Then they can. So it's a little subtle. It's a strong energy. It's not some kind of game. And it symbolizes the next step in human evolution. Awakening the Kundalini is the next step. Now, Ramakrishna, the great liberated being in the 1880s, something like that, talked about it as spiritual life doesn't even begin until the Kundalini is awakened. That's how strongly he felt about it. Okay? And so there's this transmission of energy that needs to happen. Now, how does that happen? By look, by touch, by breath, by sound. Okay? Now, for me, I was initiated, Mukta and I actually blew into my mouth. I didn't know anything. He did it. And later, and I felt the energy go in, and I began to have all kinds of experiences. Now, these experiences are called kriyas. Sometimes there's a physical movement going on. your head will spin around or something like that. And there's emotional kriyas, like emotional release. And it could be just spiritual kriyas where you start having visions. So I was having, and also what we call pranayama or breathing, spontaneous breathing.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a lot of experience in some of those things. And when those things happened, I took note of it, you know. So the point I'm making is it's most safely and easiest awakened by the transmission of energy from a master. And again, it's by look, by touch, by sound, and by breath. Mm-hmm. And those are the classic ways of doing it. Now, it used to be only transferred from guru to one disciple who then did the lineage. Muktananda changed it in the sense that he began giving it to thousands of people. And I think that's that was a shift. Suddenly it's like his position was my guru, Nityananda, Muktananda's guru, actually instructed him to wake up the world. Okay, that changes it. You're not just waking up one person. See, for him, he got Shaktipat from Nityananda, and maybe a few people got it from Nityananda. It wasn't, you're waking up the world. And that was his message to me. And acknowledge me, it's like, okay, do it. Awake as many people as you can. That's part of this tour.
Yes, yes.
To be honest with you, is that I am fulfilling that directive. I've been doing this since 1982. But that is the mission, and so that's the kind of the overview and all the descent of grace, because you don't necessarily earn it. Grace, you don't earn it. No. But you have to work for it. It's called a paradox. Spiritual life is full of paradoxes. Okay?
Yes.
So usually the people who have the Kundalini awakening, where it happens spontaneously, they've been doing a lot of spiritual practices. But they may be doing it on their own. They may have, in a tradition that doesn't even know about Kundalini. I'm not going to mention those traditions. A lot of those people come to me because, like, what just happened? And, I explain it, and then everything's fine. Because as soon as you explain what's going on, then everybody can relax a little bit. So it can, as I say, spontaneous, intentionally, which is the best and safest and clearest way to do it. That's what we're doing on this tour.
Yes. Well, I would say that you have indirectly answered almost all my questions. So now, could I ask you, just to place the phenomena of Kundalini in a broad context, is Kundalini or a physiological phenomena? Is it related somehow to the physical body, or is it a subtle phenomena altogether?
So that's a very good question. And it's both. But let me explain a little bit. I feel in my book, particularly when it's spiritual nutrition and the waking of Kundalini, it's all of those. So the Kundalini initially, and I'll just share my experience, I had some difficulty, what we call spina bifida culta, which is L5, S1 being fused. And I had a little bit of operation to get things out, but I was still causing lots of pain. And so when I got Shaktipat, where he blew into my mouth, didn't do touch down there, the base of the spine, I went into like 2 weeks of pretty severe pain. Then it went away. Done. That's it. Never again. What's the problem? So what can we conclude? Well, there was a physiological change. Okay. Now that's one level. At another level, So that's physical. And then we talk about subtle body, and also we talk about astral plane. Subtle body levels, there can be blockages with the chakras, and we sometimes using the technical terms vertes and vasanas and chakras. So each chakra has a set of petals according to which one it is. Like there's 2 petals in the Ajna chakra, and there's 12 in the heart. And each of those petals has a certain thought form on it called the verti. Now, if that's out of balance, and the Kundalini is going to be working with it, it's going to bring it back into balance. And that's where it's going to be working on the emotional plane. And I'm going to say thought form because there's certain thought forms, because part of like the heart chakra, we're looking at hope and we're looking at love, and we're talking different aspects. So it's beginning to balance the petals of the chakra. And so we call that emotional, but also psychological, and a little higher spiritual. Now, the next level, we go up where it's still working. But I'm going to say those are the main 2 levels. And as it works through our kriyas, we have old thought forms that are stored. Those are called vasanas when they're old and they're really repetitive. Or vertes, not so old, okay? But these are locked in the system and often block our evolution. That's really important to understand, because what Kundalini is doing is unblocking the blocks of our evolution, of our spiritual evolution. So at that level, these vasanas, old thought forms, are released. So when I get somebody shocked about it and they say, well, this old thing, and suddenly it's gone. I don't have that issue anymore. It just went away. I wasn't even thinking about it. It went away. That is the releasing of stored thought forms that are blocking our evolution. So
yes.
A lot of that happens spontaneously. You're not thinking about it. It does it. So we have physical, we have emotional, and we also have mental thought form levels. Now, this Kundalini is pretty interesting stuff, right? So it's also overall preparing all our nadis, all our channels to have an optimum flow of the Kundalini. And there's certain protective mechanisms in the Kundalini. We call them granthis, knots, translated. Okay. And they regulate the flow. Again, I talk about it in my book now. I have to tell you, a lot of these things aren't talked about. And I came about it because it was happening to me. It was very clear. I was being given this information, okay, directly, and then I go look it up. In the ancient texts, I said, what is this? That's how I learned about it. That's how I used those terms. I didn't know about it as it was happening, okay? But afterwards I did. And so as a Westerner, I was basically given the spiritual anatomy, which I've spent a lot of time transferring that information to the world so we know what's going on. Because the Eastern isn't quite as descriptive. Being a scientist, publishing papers in biochemistry and biophysics, it's like, you're going to write it down and you're going to make it clear so everybody can hear it. It's just part of my background. So that is part of what is going on, is it's literally changing your structure. Now, when I also had the Kundalini awaken in the second session, a rash went up my spine, like the Kundalini. lasted for about 2 weeks. And in that process, it burned up a whole lot of stuff. So it is burning up excess thought forms, blockages, and basically helping you become a superconductor of the divine. Then it also speaks to you. So I described it was my first meditation, where I went into the nothing. I didn't know anything about that, the nothing. I knew nothing about the nothing. And I was like, whoa, I disappeared. And on the way coming down, a little voice rang out. And it said, you should learn to eat and live in a way that feeds the Kundalini. That was a directive. It was like, it wasn't like, oh, it'd be a good idea. No, this is what you're doing. This is your work. So it was the will of God without exceptions. Let's put it that way. You're going to do this, whether you like it or not. Okay. So that actually started my work. In 1986, I wrote my first book, Spiritual Nutrition and the Rainbow Diet. So that gives you a feeling for it. So the Kundalini is working on every level. Now, I also want to explain that it primarily, as I said before, is more physical, subtle, and astral plane levels. Because it's not the highest frequency. But you have to go through all the knots. There's Brahma, there's 3 knots. One is at the base, and one's at the heart, and one's at the third eye. And those all have to open. And then the Kundalini, in essence, has finished its job. And it's like the 2 snakes in here. If you see the drawings in ancient things, it always ends here. Okay. Well, obviously, there's a little bit more to it than that here. So what's going on? So the Kundalini transforms the system. So the spiritual energy, which has already been activated, can flow more strongly throughout the whole system, doing its job. But then you go beyond it. And that's the Brahmanadi. It's the only one, they all in here, Ida Pagali. The Brahmanadi is the only one that goes to the crown chakra. And that's where the liberation happens.
Yes.
And that, now, it's my belief system, only because that's the way it worked, is that has to be activated by the guru. So I kind of knew this and didn't know this. I'll explain. So I'm meditating 6 hours a day. I'm meditating from 2:30 to 4:30 in the morning, and then 12:30 to 2:30, and then in the evening, 5:30 to 4:30 to 6:30. Okay, this is my routine. So I'm just meditating. India gets a little hot, so I was meditating without any clothes, just my shawl over me on where we lived. It's very private. And suddenly a voice says, get up and go to Muktanada's inner courtyard. I never would have done that on my own. Okay? Because I try to just be I was on the inner process. I wasn't counting on an outer process so much. And then it said, sit down. So I got there. It's a kind of an inner meditation now. And then I sit down, and then he comes out in his pajamas, red pajamas, because I peeked, so whoa. And then he starts pulling on this area here, moving it and pulling it, which is the activating of the final step.
Yes.
The line had gone all the way up, but the final step was he had to activate it to complete it. And that turns out to be, as I looked it up later, very traditional. So that gives you a feeling. So the Kundalini, in a sense, ends a little bit here primarily, but there is one Brahmanadi continues. one thin stream. And if you look at my book, it's just a little white line. I don't emphasize it too much, but that's kind of the key piece to it.
Yes, yes. So using this point of your story of this initiation, unexpected initiation by Swami Muktananda, do we have to have a teacher to have our Kundalini awakened? In the sense that, do we have to have a teacher who we are fully devoted to and who we carefully work with?
It's a really good question. It's actually a very subtle question, because I've seen different levels. I think it's best to have that kind of teacher and have that kind of relationship. What's the downside? You can get caught in the relationship and not transcend it. You know, and that's important to be aware of, because I'm going to divert a little bit. So we're born into I am awareness. Okay, and we think that's the where it's all about. But in liberation, you have to go beyond the I am awareness into I-ness, and eventually even the I-ness disappears. So if you're hanging on to the I am awareness, it's going to block you. And it's the same thing with the spiritual teacher. You know, some spiritual teachers kind of hold on to you, but really the process at the end is you have to walk that path by yourself. Okay. Now, doesn't mean they don't show up to do what Muktananda did, but it's your responsibility at a certain point. So the role of the teacher is support your spiritual practices, help you with questions. If you fall into a certain hole, well, they've usually fallen into that hole 30 years before. They can, you know?
Yeah.
And then, but at some point, you're not transcending them, but you have to, the last bit has to be more on your own. But with the support of the teacher, but you're it. So they guide you to this high place, because I find, unfortunately, there are a lot of people think they can do it on their own, and there are a lot of ruined lives along the way, even dead, physically dead bodies. So when we don't really respect this process, it's important to have a teacher. If you play the piano, do you just learn to play the piano, or do you have a piano teacher? I mean, how complicated is that? You need a piano teacher. But the subtlety is the relationship is all built at the end to help you become more independent, and you make the last steps.
Yes.
So you need the teacher. It's way to your advantage to have the teacher, especially if they understand about the awakened Kundalini, and then go further. I've had some Zen people come to me who had spontaneous Kundalini awakening because they did a lot of meditation. And they're having kriyas, and they're literally, this is true, this Zen master's hitting them on the head. They're having kriyas. You're not supposed to move. I'm sorry. I'm having, I don't know what's going on. I'm going crazy. You know, and it sounds funny, right? But if they don't, the teacher does not understand what's going on, they can get in the way. So I see people, more than a few people, who have had a problem because it's mostly in the Zen, traditions. There's a certain protocol it's supposed to have. Well, when the Kundalini doesn't care about protocols, it's a care about liberation. So,
yes.
So if that is can be a difficulty. For people, if they really want to believe in the religious part of it and follow a certain thing. So the guru is important, but the guru is not supposed to get in the way. You're supposed to enhance your freedom. That's the key. They're not supposed to control you. They're not supposed to, take your energy in different ways. But they're there to enhance your liberation.
Yes, beautiful. So now here's a question from a different angle, a question that is frequently raised. Can one go through the spiritual journey without awareness or knowledge of Kundalini whatsoever? Because I know that some teachers have ignored this aspect.
It's a really, again, it's an interesting question. Let's say it's a whole lot easier if you know what's going on.
Yes.
And if you don't, still by the force of your sadhana, by your spiritual practice, you're meditating, you're doing pranayama, you're doing the yoga asanas, it can happen. It just doesn't happen in such a conscious or smooth way. And you also need someone to be able to tell you when you've crossed over into the world of liberation. It's one of the goals of the spiritual group. I was fortunate both Muktananda and Swami Prakashananda were kind of my two gurus. Both acknowledged me, not at the same time, but within a few weeks. But kind of shared my story. Okay. But it's not as simple like that, because people can tell stories. They're looking at your energy. They've been working with you for a while, so they're seeing your evolution. And they see that there is that transformation. It takes one to know one, put it that way. So when people become like self-proclaimed enlightened beings without, let's say, a lineage, you have to be a little suspicious. And it's not unusual that some of these people make those proclamations crash, because they don't have the grounding. They didn't have the training. They don't have the energetics of the lineage. So the answer is, it really does make a difference to have the guru, spiritual teacher, and have a close enough relationship that you trust them. Because for me, there's nothing more important than liberation. So that's the most important thing you're trusting them with, is supporting that process, not diverting it for their own need. Does that make sense? Does that
Yes, definitely. Yes, thank you. Now, what does completion of the Kundalini process mean in actuality, experientially speaking, in terms of perception, in terms of one state?
Again, very sophisticated question. So first, I start by talking about the physio Kundalini. I said, for myself and for people I've observed, it takes about 2 years. You're doing your practice, and you're meditating, and you're chanting, and you're doing all these things, and it's unfolding, and you're having kriyas, and this is happening, that's happening, okay? But suddenly everything gets quiet. The mind is totally quiet. Kriyas have stopped. Movements have stopped. And you're just in solitude. That process is what I call the physio Kundalini. So the lower levels of the Kundalini have completed. The place where it reaches the third knot here is what I would call the completion of it. It's here. But it doesn't take you all the way, because ultimately you still have that Brahmanati getting. By that time, it's already happening in you. So the work of the Kundalini, from my perspective, is the physio Kundalini, clearing all these chakras and imbalanced thought forms and physical things that are off, and all the karmas are being burned up. I won't say all, but the essential karmas that have to be burned up, the Kundalini goes after. You don't even know what's going on. I didn't know. I'm not saying I consciously, but I did not consciously know. It's like, fine, it's burning it up, and I'm just showing up. That's my advice. Just keep showing up. But then it all gets quiet. So then you've reached another level. Okay, and the Kundalini is still working, but it's a more subtle level. You have the more subtle level of the heart energy opening and of the third eye energy opening. And it's very quiet. Okay. And then even that, when you complete it, you can feel it. And then there's the last step where you're beyond the three knots. That's how you kind of know it. So if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes,
And
it is deeply felt. Yes.
it helps to have a teacher kind of guiding you and checking in with you. It's not like I'm checking in every day. That's not what was happening. I mean, at the very beginning, because I didn't know what was going on, yeah, for a month or so. But this is a 7-year process. And you're checking in at periodic times. I'll put it that way. It could be once a week, once a month. It just varies.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the best way to answer that.
Yes, thank you. So you've addressed this point here and there in your previous answers, but what are the central ways or methods in which we can support the awakening and stabilization of our Kundalini? I think you've mentioned right eating, but perhaps we can elaborate on this point.
Sure. Just thinking one other thought. Ramakrishna had tremendous Kundalini experiences, and he would have all kinds of samadhis and this and that, but he was still kind of identified with the Divine Mother, and he was stuck. Now he's at a very high level of liberation, but he's identified with it. He won't let go of her. His guru took a rock and hit him in the third eye. Literally, he's bleeding, right? It's like, can you please wake up? Stop, let go. And that's some of the things sometimes the guru has to do, even called hitting you in the head with a rock, But it took him to the next level. And he, again, was extraordinarily high level, before that. But he was still attached. Like, that's the I am attachment, the Divine Mother. And it's like, you can't be liberated if you're going to be attached to that. So you have to let go of all attachment. I'm just saying that's the subtlety of some of that. Sometimes you need a hit in the head, literally. So, okay. So back to your question. What I have done, because my job is to make it easy for Westerners. And it's my style as a physician to kind of categorize it. Okay, so I talk about the 6 foundations and 7-fold peace. So the 6 foundations are essentially, and 7-fold peace, are a way of life. I call it the path of liberation that takes you to liberation. That may take you to liberation, but it's a way of life. Now, what's good about it is it's a way of life and it's good for you. You'll feel better, you're clear, you're stronger, everything's better. So it's a win-win no matter what. So in the 6 foundations, the first foundation is eating in a way to become a superconductor of the divine. That's a key. And we'll be talking about that on the tour, because the diet changes. I've observed this. I mean, I was trying to understand what's needed here. You give up meat, fish, chicken, and dairy, and you get what we call in Indian more sattvic diet for current times. In 2,000 years ago, dairy was considered sattvic because the cows weren't all filled with pesticides and herbicides, and they weren't mistreated and so forth. And you needed some B12, which you don't need the cows enough for that. So now dairy is not sattvic. And it does clog the nadis, the 72,000 nadis through which the Kundalini energy flows. I think we have to be, kind of aware. So you have to have a diet that's going to amplify you as a superconductor. So all those things that clog it. Now let's explain this again in a different way. An animal, you eat some meat. Now that animal has fear, pain, and misery before it's killed. I mean, that's what happens to them. You know you're going to get killed. You get pain, fear, and misery. You know, they're not enlightened. They're not at peace. It's like, this is terrible. Okay? And that pain and misery and that adrenaline that's released and that adrenochrome, which another story, but that's all released into that flesh that you're eating, goes into you, and it kind of agitates the mind. Okay. The pain, misery, and fear actually gets into the subtle nadis, that are there, and blocks the flow and creates fears, create all kinds of what we call vertices, excess thought forms of fear and misery. So it's literally a sludge, and physically, but also it creates all kinds of upset with the fear and misery, and activates the mind rather than calms it. Now, some of the yogic teachings, which I happen to agree with, also point out that when you eat an animal, you're taking on its animal ego, an animal soul. So there's a de-evolution happening when you're eating flesh food, fish, chicken, dairy. And so it's not my idea. It's it's kind of more traditional teachings, and among the more evolved yogis, that you're taking on their soul energy, you're taking on their oppression, and you're literally taking on their animal ego. So that adds to your animal ego, pulling you down. Where you're eating a sattvic diet, no meat, fish, chicken, or dairy, okay, you're building your spiritual ego, your evolutionary ego. Now, you don't want to build the ego, but understand you want way more than taking an animal ego. That you don't want.
Yeah.
So key is no meat, fish, chicken, or dairy there. Now, we're not talking about pesticides and herbicides. There's lots of reasons, but I'm talking only spiritual reasons. Okay. There's ecological reasons okay. So that's key. The other thing I do recommend is fasting. I like a spiritual juice fast twice a year for about 7 days. Okay. And that further clears the system and activates the Kundalini. So what I'm doing, Shaktipat on a fast, we're looking at 90% of the people having Kundalini awakening, when it's just I'm giving Shaktipat maybe 60%. There is a difference. You get more refined, your energy can flow more easily. Okay, so that's foundation one. Second foundation is build the prana, life force. Sacred dance, which we'll be doing on the tour, get people dancing a little bit, spiritual joy. But that's not by accident. That actually moves it. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Yoga asana, which we'll also be doing. And then things like Reiki, Tai Chi, Qigong, Pranayama, which I'll also be teaching, all expand the prana. The more expanded the prana is, the more power behind the Kundalini movement. The third is service and charity. Now, people don't add a lot to it, but in India, we call it karma yoga. It was definitely seen as part of it. Why? Because you're opening your heart to somebody else, and you're uplifting humanity, which is part of the spiritual process. So, I do a lot of work with diabetes prevention centers, maybe 26 of them around the world in about 13 countries, things like that. Or like in Cameroon, we have over 50 organic veganic farms. First, we got started with, some funding, and then they're getting funded. And then, that kind of thing, that it's good. Opens your heart, makes the connection. Fourth is working with a spiritual teacher if you are egologically ready. The biggest objection to working with spiritual teachers is called your ego. And part of the advantage of working with a spiritual teacher, it helps you overcome your ego to kind of trust somebody who to elevate you. You have to be able to trust somebody. That's a whole sacred relationship. Mm-hmm. Very important. Okay, and they have the background and all the things we talked about, the lineage, the energy. The fifth is the meditating and repeating a mantra, which helps you focus during the day as well. So you're keeping the awakened awareness throughout the day. And usually that's given to you by your spiritual teacher, mantra. And we'll be doing that on the tour as well. Mm-hmm. And then the sixth is awakening the Kundalini or adding as much energy as possible to keep expanding the Kundalini. So on this tour that we're on, we're doing all 6 foundations. And those are your primary things. Now, in addition, I talk about the sevenfold peace. It's just subtly, but not so different. And I'll just mention it. So we have peace with the body, which we mentioned, peace with the mind, with the meditation. Peace with the family is relationship, and that's part of who we are as human beings. It's more in the West as an issue because relationship is definitely a spiritual path to liberation if you take it. And you want to be a good relationship with all those around you, your family and so forth. Then there's peace with the community, the larger community. In today's world, that's really a significant issue because of the chaos in the world. And peace to me, the way I define it is you find the right relationship so you're not being bothered by what's going on,
Yeah.
And then peace with all cultures. Now that's a little bit more Native American, we call Omataki Lassen. And we say peace with the living earth as a culture, the rock people. And there'll be some Native American teaching because as I'm a Native American sun dancer for 4 years and an eagle dancer. So peace with the rock people, which is the living planet. Peace with the plant world. Peace with the walking, the animal world, flying, and peace with humans. So it's kind of those 4 levels that you're really at peace with the living planet and with the experience of God in the living planet. Then I call it sacred ecology. So you really become one with the living planet. We're not talking ecology, you're defending trees. I'm talking about something different. You see yourself not as separate, but you're one with the living planet. That's just really subtle and important thing. And then peace with God. So those are the sevenfold peace. That's 13, and we mystically 13 becomes 1. 3 becomes 1. So, that is the way of life that has the potential to lead to liberation. Now, it doesn't guarantee you're going to liberate in this lifetime, but if you keep doing this, you get stronger and stronger, deeper and deeper. So it's a win-win.
Yes.
And so that's kind of the way of life that in general is good. It generally uplifts the planet, generally uplifts everybody around you. And then it is the nutrition, spiritual, physical nutrition to enhance the Kundalini. So that was a good question. And we'll definitely be talking about that on the tour. People really we have to do the basics, and part of the basics is being able to do that.
Well, this is without doubt a complete path.
Yes,
embracing all aspects, all dimensions.
That is very perceptive, and that's exactly the truth. It's a complete. It is a way of life that can lead to liberation. It's just a way of life, and that's how I like to think about it.
Wonderful. Another question is, I know that you are an advocate of the more, let's call it feminine or responsive approach to Kundalini. Is it helpful or dangerous to manipulate our Kundalini awakening through intentional practices? Because there are certain practices out there that manipulate the Kundalini or push it upwards.
Yeah. It's actually a very important question. And as you pointed out, I supporting the natural flow of the Kundalini. Now, that being said, there's certain basics. And we're going to get into a paradox here. So it's good. It's good because it's a good question. You can't have a goal with this. That's why I emphasize the way of life. I'm going to awaken the Kundalini. I'm going to do these practices. I'm going to get liberated. That's a goal. That's an ego goal, and it actually blocks you because ego always blocks you. The way it is. So I like to look at it as a way of life that supports the evolution rather than a series of practices. And sometimes you need to do more pranayama. Sometimes you need to do more meditating. Sometimes you need, so there's a certain flow with this according to what you need at a certain point in time. So if you do it as a practice rather than as a flow, it can get in the way. So, but generally speaking, this is not true for everybody. Ramana Maharshi at age 17 just had an awakening. He didn't do much, and then he had to meditate for a few years.
Yes.
But he didn't do previous practices, but it was directing him to meditate. So, everybody's a little different. So the Kundalini relates to us as a unique, as unique beings, and it will give us what we need. I think that's a way of thinking about it. And our job is to not override it with our ego, saying, this is the practice my teacher, I'm going to do this. Well, no, it's saying, be dancing and singing. You need that. Or you need to be meditating more. Or you need to be doing more, hatha yoga or pranayama, you see. So there has to be a delicate balance between its inner guidance. That is the way I did it. Now I'm living in an ashram. I have two gurus who were guiding me. It's like, but they all had the wisdom to say, this is a true story. So it was driving me to meditate. I'm meditating 6 hours a day. I literally went up to McDonald and said, I don't know what's going on. You were recommending we meditate 1 hour a day. Okay, well, somehow this Kundalini has got me going 6 hours a day. What do you have? And he thought that was the funniest thing. Okay? And he just started laughing. It's like, what kind of idiot are you? But he said, no, just go with the flow of the Kundalini. And that's really the message is that if you have a set regimen, you're in the way. So if it says your teacher says meditate an hour a day and you're doing 6, that's the flow. Just do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way to think about
it. Wonderful. So you mentioned before, this is a question I've been asked many times, and I'm curious to hear from you directly. What is a Kundalini crisis? How does it come about? And also, how can it be resolved?
We started the first Kundalini crisis clinic in the world in 1976, myself and Dr. Lee Sinella, who was initiated about the same time I was by Muktananda. And we were kind of neighbors too in California, Petaluma, California. And he was also a psychiatrist. And we saw that for some people, the energy just seemed too much for them. Or their experiences were more than they were mentally ready to handle, at least mentally prepared enough to be able to handle it. And people will go into crisis like, this is above my head. I mean, I can't handle this. It's driving me crazy. Okay, so we would work with that group of people, and that was pretty easy to work with, and support them. Sometimes you have people, and that was even with Muktananda, but sometimes you have people who have a spontaneous awakening, they don't have a lineage, and it's just too wild for them to handle, okay? And are they psychotic? Well, if it happens in a person who's mentally imbalanced, that can be a problem. So part of the reason our work is distinguishing, is this psychosis or is this Kundalini with some mental imbalance? Because there's a certain amount of people, before we started writing about this, talking about this, Dr. Lisa wrote Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence. That was a book he wrote. And his name is Lee. So Lee, we kind of worked out how to make that diagnosis. Okay, from a psychiatric and a Kundalini point of view, because they can overlap a little bit, because it can be kind of a wild experience. And you can appear to be delusional. Okay. But if you're really delusional, that's the psychosis. If you're just getting very high and very, manic in a certain way, you can see that with. So it's being able to make that distinction. Not so easy. I believe there are a lot of people with Kundalini awakening who end up in psychiatric hospitals because people are not trained to see the difference. There are often people who've had spontaneous awakenings and there isn't anyone around them that actually understands what's going on. So they end up getting a hospital, they end up getting medicated and so forth. So that's the Kundalini crisis. Okay. Third is just plain psychosis, but they've heard, or their family has heard the language of Kundalini and said, well, no, it's really Kundalini. They're not crazy, but oh no, they really are psychotic. So there's three categories, and the work is to be able to distinguish that. Now, I got started with this because Muktananda assigned me to deal with people in the ashram who were having kind of a crisis. It was just too much energy for them. And so I had to balance them. So it was, that was really how I learned it. It wasn't like I picked this area of expertise. I wasn't, well, here's that guy, just take care of it. Well, he knew what he was doing, but you get what I'm saying. That was an assignment. These people are sent to you. That's the way it is. You work in a clinic and they're sent to you. And that's, I know it seems really funny, but that's the way it worked. I always worked for the good. There were many issues that came up. That's how I learned. These things would come up. You take care of it. It was very funny. I mean, how it worked, but he gave me directions that ultimately have played a role in my life.
Now, perhaps it is time to ask you a couple of questions in relation to Shaktipat, the phenomena of Shaktipat, because this is something that your tour in Europe will also focus on. As a part of your work with people, you give what has traditionally been known as Shaktipat. I have been also fortunate to receive Shaktipat initiations from you. Now, what is Shaktipat? What is its subtle mechanism? What happens when someone receives a Shaktipat?
Okay, so depending on how ready you are, different things happen. So people who aren't ready, they get Shaktipat and nothing really happens. They feel some energy, but nothing really happens. Put that category away, because that's not really what we're talking about. Now, in your case, you were ready. You were spiritually ready. So that little bit that gets added from the spiritual, cosmic spiritual energy activated your Kundalini energy enough so that your whole Kundalini mechanism began to activate and activate your evolution, your spiritual evolution. That's pretty much it, you know. Now, again, there are different ways to activate it, and literally sometimes you can do it over the internet, believe it or not, by a look, okay? Which is good news, because with all the lockdowns and all that, okay, this we can still do it. So that's it. Now, what's important is to have Shaktipat from a awakened being who has a lineage behind them. That's the safest way to make it happen. And so that's the, primary. Some people, they're doing meditation, they're intensely practicing, so to speak, and it can awaken spontaneously because they've created enough energy to make that happen. Now, the problem is they may not be able to be balanced with it. Now, there's an additional issue, is that once it's awakened, you really have the spiritual obligation to create a lifestyle that supports them. So I've seen people, my Kundalini got awakened 20 years ago, but I didn't really take it seriously. I didn't do it. Now it's like, it's died down, which is what can happen.
Right.
And, we'll give them Shaktipat and get it going, activate it again, but don't, ignore it now. You have a tremendous gift. It's a great spiritual gift. It's a rarity in our lifetimes. Take it seriously. So there are all those kind of categories, if that makes sense. And the key is when the door opens, walk through it. It's about as simple as I can put it. So it's a great gift, and it's important to be able to take advantage of it. Yes, it can be a spiritual and energetic hit, but if you aren't following it, I remember when I was, the first one or two times, it was in the Oakland ashram, Oakland, California. And this other guy who I kind of knew a little bit, was pretty psychic, and he was having all kinds of experiences. But I met him a few years later, and it's like nothing was happening for him. He never did the work, and he had, remorse for not doing it, because it can go down and just be at a simmer, so to speak, metaphorically. So the key is your response to it and taking it seriously, like you did, like you have. So that's the key. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, yes.
And so we have it in all the different traditions. they don't call it Kundalini, right? Giving the touch, or 12 years with the guru and then gets awakened. Well, you're going to have that interaction. It's going to awaken it. So that's why some traditions don't talk about it, because they don't have the understanding. I don't think it serves people not to know about it, but it can still be awakened. Those are the people I would see in the Kundalini Crisis Clinic. Like, what's going on? This is awakened. I'm a practitioner. I'm doing this. And so what? And that is, you don't need to go through that when you kind of have people who already know about the energy and the lineage. Does that answer it? Does that make sense?
Yes. So one last question. Is Shaktipat beneficial also for beginners, since it is clear that traditionally it has been transmitted in an esoteric manner? You mentioned that Swami Muktananda somehow inaugurated a certain revolution in the concept of Shaktipat, right?
Yes.
So is it beneficial also for beginners? If I'm a beginner and I come to meet you while you're touring in Europe?
That's called a leading question. So, but it's a good question. Yes, it is, because how do you know your background? We have many lifetimes. Are we really a beginner, or were you meant to have this meeting because you're ready, to have it awaken? Generally, I don't think anybody comes without knowing at some level that it's their time to get awakened. And so you may look like a beginner, but when you look at so many lifetimes that people are going, you're not necessarily a beginner. You really, it's not going to awaken for a beginner. Now, I mean, person who hasn't been practicing throughout lifetimes. Okay, so you have to reach a certain point before you can receive the grace. Maybe that's the best way to talk about it. But you take Ramana Maharshi, and he's 17. He doesn't know anything. Look what happened. Happened spontaneously. So when it's your time, should you find the spiritual teacher, or you just go think of this is cool, I'll do it. But you're not there by accident. No one who comes during this time will be there by accident, even though they may think, well, this is interesting and this is entertaining. No, it's not really what's going on. So it's an important question. So the answer is, if you had no previous experience and you're drawn to it, it's a pretty good suggestion that you are ready. Okay, even though you haven't been doing this in your life up to this point. And that's why we don't stop with, oh, hey, here's Kundalini awakening. You can learn the 6 foundations. And how do we support people with that? So we'll cover it. Now, some of the tour there'll be, I may be teaching yoga asana as well. And there'll be maybe a yoga teacher. I will be teaching the pranayama, which is important. We will be talking about service and charity, obviously spiritual nutrition, and the relationship, the subtlety of relationship with the guru, and how to keep it going, because you want to keep it going. It's grace, but it only works if you pay attention to it. So that's a perfect question. Thank you.
Good. So I'm very grateful for all these gems of wisdom that you've bestowed on us today.
Thank you, Shai. It's my joy. It's also my job, but it's my joy.
Thank you.